Welcome everyone to the first webinar in Sustainable Conservation's Solutions in Our Soil webinar series. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you also to our generous sponsors, Environmental Science Associates, Spotswood Estate Vineyards and Winery, and Iron Horse Winery. Thank you for supporting our Spring 2023 webinar series and for sharing Sustainable Conservation's vision of stewarding our most precious natural resources for all Californians. My name is Ryan Flaherty, and I'm Sustainable Conservation's Director of Circular Economies. Before I introduced our special guest, I wanted to give some background on sustainable conservation. For those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation advances the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people. Sustainable Conservation and our partners are working in many ways to advance more resilient water systems in California, from groundwater recharge to accelerating restoration, to rethinking how we utilize nutrients and agricultural byproducts, among others. And one common thread among all of this work is soil. Soil and soil health practices can provide many benefits, including healthier and more resilient watersheds. They can help slow down water and get it into the ground, which is critical as we face more extreme precipitation and flooding, as we've seen over the past few months. Soils can also help hold water for later use, which is critical as we face more prolonged droughts. And they can also help us retain nutrients in the root zone, reducing runoff and leaching that is essential for us to protect community drinking water. So thus the name of our webinar series, Solutions in Our Soils. Over the course of 4 webinars, we will dig into many aspects of how we can utilize soils to build a more resilient California in the face of climate change. And I'm very excited to kick off today with you all. And first, we'd like to get a better sense of who you are, who's in the audience. So we have a few questions we'd like you to respond to in a Zoom poll. There's 3 questions. They're all in one poll. We'll wait a little bit, give a minute for you all to select your answers, and then we'll close the poll in about 30 seconds or so. We'll give a few more seconds. We're getting close. Okay. Let's go ahead and close the poll. It looks like we've got a good mix of representatives from the state. We have a decent mix of people from different types of organizations, from academia to agriculture, government, nonprofit, and a good mix of expertise on soil health. So it looks like we have a pretty diverse audience here, which is great. Really looking forward to the conversation today. So with that, now that we know who you are, and you all know who you are, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest, Liz Carlisle. Liz is an assistant professor in the environmental studies program at UC Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on food and farming. Born and raised in Montana, she got hooked on agriculture while working as an aide to organic farmer and US Senator John Tester, which led to a decade of research and writing collaborations with farmers from her home state. She has written 3 books about regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming and agroecology, Lentil Underground, Grain by Grain, and most recently, Healing Grounds, Climate, Justice, and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. She's also a frequent contributor to both academic journals and popular media outlets, focusing on food and farm policy, incentivizing soil health practices, and supporting new entry farmers. She holds a PhD in geography from UC Berkeley and a BA in folklore and mythology from Harvard University. And prior to her career as a writer and academic, she spent several years touring rural America as a country singer. So welcome, Liz.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation, and great to be here with everybody from all over the state and all these different backgrounds. I'm slightly intimidated that there are experts in soil health on the call. Y'all definitely know more than I do, but I care a lot about it. So that's where I'm coming from.
Well, we appreciate you being here, and we're going to spend about the next 30 minutes in conversation, and we'll save time at the end to answer some of the audience questions. So for those of you in the audience, please add your question to the Q&A box. So there's a chat box and a Q&A box. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A box as we're talking, and then as we get towards the end of the hour, we'll answer as many of those as we can. So let's get started. Liz, thank you so much for being here. Not only are you an expert, I would say, in the topic, but you're a wonderful writer and a storyteller. I think your most recent book, Healing Grounds, is a must-read for anyone interested in soils and regenerative agriculture. And we at Sustainable Conservation have long looked to your research on farmer adoption of practices and barriers and incentives as we think about our strategy and our programs. So thank you for what you do, and it's so exciting to kick off this series with you.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, it's great to be in dialogue, and I'll identify as a lifelong learner who's had the privilege to learn directly from a lot of really smart folks who are trying to figure these things out in the lands that they steward.
I think that's so right. We all are lifelong learners. And on that note, I wanted to start with definitions. So our spring webinar series, Solutions in Our Soil, centers around soils and soil health. And I assume most of the audience is probably somewhat familiar with soils. We've seen it. We've probably played around with it when we were kids. We've maybe planted flowers or food in it. But what is soil health?
Yeah, I think for me, the first aha moment when I started studying soil was just that soil is alive. It's this living ecosystem. There are billions of organisms underground living out their lives. And so I think, the concept of soil health kind of calls on us to use our imaginations. Because if we were here to talk about forest health, we might imagine ourselves, walking through a forest and this dense canopy of trees and all the birds and the animals, and like the lushness of that life is something that we as human beings living above ground maybe have a memory of. But to imagine that, oh, wow, underground, there's also this incredibly diverse ecosystem of organisms interacting with each other. Unless you drive the magic school bus, you kind of have to use your imagination to realize that that's all happening. And of course, complicated even more so by the fact that a lot of really important organisms underground are actually smaller than we can see with our naked eye. So there is this really diverse teeming ecosystem, and soil health just means there's conditions to support all that life, and it's thriving. All those organisms are doing their thing, and then as we'll talk about, that's totally key to plants being able to do their thing and us being able to do our thing too.
I love that you brought up the magic school bus. I think that's a wonderful image. I have small kids that love that show, and I'm sure I know I've seen a few episodes where they have gotten into the ground and battled some of those organisms. So I think, that's the definition, or kind of one articulation of soil health. And as we think about soil health in the context of our food, it seems like every day there's a new term. So there's sustainable agriculture and climate smart agriculture and organic and regenerative and so on. It can be really confusing, and I'm hoping you can help clarify. So are these really different things, or are they basically different names for the same thing? And what is the connection to soil health?
Yeah, I totally empathize with the confusion around all the terms, and I definitely have felt it myself. I think it's helpful to think about this as like a web of concepts that are kind of an overlapping Venn diagram. And I do think that soil health is something that all of these communities share as a core goal. Certainly the organic and regenerative communities are really explicit about the idea that healthy soils are the foundation of a healthy food system. But it's definitely an important conversation for the climate smart folks as well, or for sustainability, because the climate and agriculture conversation, soil is really central to that. And then the sustainability conversation really got going in the 1980s when there was a lot of concern about soil erosion. So before, most people were talking about climate change and carbon sequestration in soils, but actually at a time when there was a lot of concern about physical erosion of soil away from agricultural landscapes and what that meant for food security. So, without getting too deep in the weeds, all of these terms have their own histories. They were coined by groups of people who thought really hard about their theory of change, about how we change from an extractive agriculture to one that's more reciprocal and is more based on the idea of renewing the places, the land, the landscapes that we all rely on. And they all are slightly different in how they think about, how that change is going to come, the way they're using language to try to build a coalition. But I do think there's that overlapping center of the Venn diagram around soil health, and that we can work together, even if we have slightly different lenses and perspectives towards building, healthier soils on our working lands.
Right. Well, so I guess as we think about building healthier soils, one of the things I think about a lot is, is there like one specific healthy soil that farmers should be striving for? If so, what is it? And if not, how do you determine if your soil is healthy as a farmer or someone growing food?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think actually one of the pitfalls of a lot of, US commercial agriculture over the last 100 years or so has been the idea that there's some kind of standardized farm, or set of metrics that everybody should be shooting for, when in fact, folks steward really diverse places, and are starting with really different kinds of soil. Soil is formed over a really long period of time. You start with the parent material, whatever the geology is in the area. It weathers, what happens in terms of climate over time has a lot to do with it. What the human history is in that area has a lot to do with it. So people are starting with really different soils. And so what healthy soil looks like, what it means to steward your farm such that it's, just as healthy and thriving as the natural ecosystems around you, looks different, because the natural ecosystems around you are going to look different depending on whether you're, farming in a river bottom, or whether you're farming, like an upland prairie, if you're, up in the Sierra foothills, or if you're on the Central Coast. I do think, soil organic matter, if you're thinking about like one thing you can measure that can help you track progress as you're using these healthy soils practices, is really helpful. As the organic matter is the fraction in the soil that used to be alive or is alive. But, don't be comparing your organic matter to somebody who's in a really different ecosystem. It's more, if any of you like have fitness goals, right? You're comparing yourself against yourself, not against somebody else who's in a different set of conditions. So it's a way that you can track the building up of organic matter, but we shouldn't expect that every farm is going to have the same target for where that organic matter is going to get. And we do have great ways of using instruments, to measure things like organic matter. I'm sure folks on this call have like sent off for a soil test, and also seen, what are your soil physical characteristics or your soil chemical characteristics that can help you measure where you're at with your soil health. But also just, you can see the color of your soil. You can feel, where your soil texture is at. And I think most of the farmers that I talk to, the biggest indicator is the health of their plants. Especially if you're managing organic and you're not using a lot of chemical tools for fertility or for pest control. Plants are going to tell you really quickly if they don't have what they need in the soil to be happy. And so that's often a way, not only, here, contemporary US, but, for thousands of years, that people have seen where their soil health is at, is really seeing what plants are telling them.
That I'm really drawn to your analogy of kind of comparing your soils to your own soils and health, because I think you know, it's true that we should, in our own weight journey, we should compare ourselves to ourselves, but that's often not what we do, right? And I think we see a lot of that when it comes to soils and farming, as well as you know, looking to others, and huge increases in soil organic matter, and I'm not getting that. So I want to come back to that probably later and talk a little bit about kind of adoption and some of the barriers for farmers. But before we do that, I wondering if you could share a little bit about, you know, what can one do, recognizing there are all these kinds of diversities, but what are things that farmers or others that are growing food can do to build healthier soils, and what are the benefits they might see?
Yeah, I do think a really good principle is thinking about how you can mimic the natural ecosystem where you are embedded. And so if you're embedded in a natural ecosystem that's historically had tree cover or, you know, been a forest, thinking about how to add those woody perennials in, whether it's part of, you know, your farming, ranching system, agroforestry, or whether it's about having, you know, hedgerows and having that on the edges of fields. Likewise, if you're embedded in a prairie ecosystem, thinking about, you know, whether you have perennial herbaceous vegetation by virtue of having some grazing, maybe even if it's in rotation, or maybe you're in the community experimenting with perennial grains, or maybe you have herbaceous perennial borders. So I do think that just looking to the ecosystem around you is a really, really great place to start. And also, you know, most natural ecosystems have a higher percentage of perennials in them than most of our agricultural ecosystems. So I think for most folks, thinking about how to add in some more perennials is a pretty solid rule of thumb. And again, whether that's in the farming system itself or around the edges of it, you know, for building up a healthy soil, the exudates that come out of plant roots are really, really, really important. I read this really interesting study that said that carbon exuded by plant roots is 5 times more likely to be stored underground and stay there for a long time than above ground carbon. So even though there's lots of great ways to add carbon through, you know, compost or other kind of amendments, mulching, having roots in the ground all year round is really, really key as a piece of your soil health program. So perennials obviously do that. Or if you have a lot of annual crops, cover crops in the off season are another way to keep those roots in the ground all year round. So the roots are really key. And then you can sort of supplement that with an amendment program that's adding organic matter. And then, you know, thinking about the diversity of the cropping system, if you're, you know, if you're in crops, if you grow plants, or thinking about regenerative grazing, if you have animals, and moving those animals around in patterns that mimic the way native herbivores related to the landscape, so that that vegetation has that opportunity to regrow. So those are a few things.
Well, there's more of that we want to tug on a little bit later. I'm wondering, you know, I know we're hitting all of this at a pretty high level, and some of this we're going to come back to and really dig a lot deeper in future webinars. But I wanted to switch a little bit to soils and water. And you know, you mentioned carbon, and carbon sequestration is one goal of healthy soils practices that a lot of people are talking about. It's a really important one. But you also mentioned others, and you know, sustainable conservation's focus is currently around water. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes digging into soils and water more. And, you know, as water is a key concern in California and California agriculture, as we're facing more extreme and prolonged droughts punctuated by extreme kind of precipitation and flooding like we've just seen. And then we also have 1 million Californians that lack access to safe and affordable drinking water. So I mentioned a little bit about this, I teased it in my intro, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that link between soils and water, and how healthier soils could improve our water availability and water quality for our communities.
Yeah, well, I think you totally hit the nail on the head at the top of the webinar. And then also, folks, like definitely stay tuned for the rest of the webinar series, because I know Hannah Waterhouse is going to talk a lot more about this, and she's an expert in this area of where soils and water intersect. So you'll get to go a lot deeper on this. But yeah, I mean, just as you said, like a healthy soil is such a great way to slow water down. And that's really important when we think about this extreme flooding that we've seen and these really heavy rain events that we've seen over the last couple months, to prevent at least some of that flooding, both on the farm and then also for downstream communities. A healthy soil is going to allow much more infiltration, so that water can actually be useful rather than the flooding and the pooling and all these things that we don't want. Andrea Beisch also did some fantastic work. She's a professor at University of Nebraska who looks at this connection between healthy soils practices and water, showing really dramatically just how much flooding could be prevented in rural communities with widespread adoption of healthy soils practices, as well as benefits for storing water on farms. And then, of course, the flip side of that is we know we're also going to be seeing more of these really long, dry summers as part of what, is in store for us in California over the coming decades. And so if we have healthy soils that are doing a better job of storing that winter moisture, we're going to have a better shot of having that water available, as you said, in the root zone, for plants that are getting pretty stressed come August or September. So yeah, I mean, especially as we're thinking about how do we reduce our reliance on groundwater that we have overdrafted and on irrigation systems, healthy soils are really our friend there, and thinking about how to use water more efficiently and make sure that those folks who aren't currently getting access to clean drinking water can get access to that drinking water, and we can use our ag water more efficiently.
Yeah, and I think, just to tug on that a little bit more, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, as that gets implemented, and we think about, better, getting to sustainable yield of the groundwater basins. And as we move forward with the SAFER program in the state, the right to the human right to water and solutions for that, I think there's a whole toolbox that is needed to do that. And I think that we share, the perspective that soils is an important kind of tool in that toolbox that shouldn't be ignored. And particularly as we think about agricultural systems. So let me put on my skeptic hat then, right? So if there are so many benefits, why aren't we seeing more of this, right? It's estimated that only about 5% of the acreage in California is implementing healthy soils practices, give or take a little, depending on the crop and the type of practice. But if there are so many benefits, shouldn't that be 50, 70, 100% of acres? What's going on here? So why aren't more farmers adopting these practices?
Yeah, no, I share that question. And there's some colleagues, I think, on the call from the Bowles Lab at UC Berkeley who did a spatial analysis of, okay, what percentage of this agricultural land? I don't remember if it was the whole state of California or maybe just the Central Coast, but it's like 5% that is utilizing cover crops and non-crop vegetation in the case of this particular study. So it is really underutilized compared to the benefits that we know can accrue both to the farm and then also to the region and ultimately to all of us, even at the global scale when you think about climate. And I think the reality is, I've talked to so many producers in California, all over the country, as a researcher, as a writer, even back to my days as a country singer. And the vast majority of people are in agriculture because they want to be good land stewards. And that's like their heart goal. But then they're also embedded in this economic context that often is really limiting. And I think the biggest limitation, and Kenzo Esquivel, who might be on here as well, and I, with colleagues, did a study recently looking specifically at barriers to soil health practices in the Central Coast. And we found that the biggest barrier is secure long-term land tenure. Because the reality of everything we just talked about, building up your organic matter by planting perennials and cover cropping, at a minimum, folks I've talked to say that's like a 5-year project. And if you're doing woody perennials as part of that, you're probably upwards of 5 years. And so you're investing all of this time and maybe like foregone cash crop, as well as potentially inputs that you're spending money on, like cover crop seed. And then the return isn't going to come until at least 5 years later. Rachel Long did a study on hedgerows and showed like, oh yeah, there's a return on investment. It's coming in 7 to 16 years. So if you're going to be there for the rest of your life, or potentially have other members of your family continuing to care for that land, that's great. That makes great economic sense. But if you have a 3-year lease or a 2-year lease or a 1-year lease, which is a reality for so many farmers in California, you can't afford to make that upfront investment when you don't know if you're going to realize those benefits down the road, or if your landlord's going to be like, oh, great, there's a lot of organic matter. I think I'm going to lease that to somebody else for more money, And I've talked to people who've said, yeah, I built that, organic matter up for the landlord, and then they were really excited to lease it to somebody else. So I think that land tenure problem is one we really need to solve to make the long-term economic benefits make sense for farmers in terms of just their short-term economic survival. And then there's a lot of alignment that we need to do also around markets and how farmers get paid. And one issue is that even though some of the benefits of these soil health practices really do accrue at the farm level, and you can see it in improved fertility and buffering against, pests and diseases and drought, if you do have that long-term, horizon, a lot of these benefits are accruing at the watershed scale or in terms of climate, even at the global scale. And so I think we do need better mechanisms if we're asking farmers to do things for public benefit, that there are public streams of money to pay for that stewardship of public resources. And I think the Healthy Soils program is a great start in California. There's a lot of exciting conversation around the Farm Bill and how we could align the federal subsidy money better with these kind of public benefits. But then I also think like the markets through which, all of us are buying food could maybe do a better job of valuing soil health practices too. And this is where I get excited about things like food hubs and aggregators and public procurement and, especially for like the medium to large scale growers who are having a really hard time finding those values-based markets and are getting stuck with pretty rigid requirements that wholesalers have that make it really tough to do ecological management. How do we make sure that we have more markets that are really valuing all of these ecological benefits and ways for the eater and the producer to kind of talk to each other about these shared values?
Well, I think the way you just described that is one of the things I so appreciate about your approach, Liz, is, it's such an area where it's so easy to get into a blame game and it's all this one sector's fault. But I think what I hear from you is there's something we can all do, right? There's improvements we can all make in each of our different roles. And I'm wondering if you could share, a success story that you've seen, kind of a solution that you've seen that's broken through some of these barriers that you just mentioned.
Yeah, so many. I mean, that's why my job is so cool. It's I get to talk to people who've found really cool ways, to implement these healthy soils practices and regenerative relationships with land in all different kinds of ways, in individual farms, but also in whole communities. I just want to shout out in Healing Grounds, one of the folks I wrote about, Aide Guzman, who's born and raised in California from the Central Valley, raised by farm workers who had actually migrated from a diversified family farm in Mexico. And Aide did this incredible research project for her dissertation at Berkeley with a group of small farmers in the Central Valley who were utilizing more diversified cropping rotations and actually diverse crops in one point in time, polycultures really, and found that these folks were actually increasing soil microbial diversity. They had 2 times as many different kinds of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi as reference farms that were similar, but were growing just one crop. And so that's a really hopeful story to me because it shows that there's this real link between cultural diversity in the agricultural sector, between diversity of crops, and then ultimately microbial diversity that's driving soil health. And And then this researcher, Ade Guzman, who's demonstrating all of this with, really exciting new genomic technologies that we have to show what's happening in these communities in the soil.
I'm wondering if you could, for those that aren't maybe as familiar, just talk briefly about those communities in the soil and why that's so important.
Yeah, well, really, you should hear Ide talk about it, because I will never forget the very first time I heard her talk. She was just like, you all have to know, our buscular mycorrhizal fungi are so cool. Like, they actually help land plants, like, make the journey from the ocean onto land, like all these gajillion years ago. So yeah, I mean, plants have relationships with fungi in the soil. The vast majority of our terrestrial plants have a relationship with fungi in order to live and thrive and grow. And so, if you're a farmer, you grow plants. And so having those fungal communities in the soil is really, really important to the function and health of the plants. And yeah, I mean, so many interesting things I learned from Ide, like, yeah, we still have our buscular mycorrhizal fungi on a lot of, more industrial monocropped farms, but they tend to be the ruderal taxa, or the more selfish AMF, that aren't actually giving back things that plants need to be healthy. And so it's these more diversified farms that then give rise to the more diversified AMF communities, which confer the soil health benefits we're all really interested in. So also really interesting, because this has been studied a lot in natural ecosystems, but not a whole lot in agricultural systems, because ecologists have just assumed that there's not a whole lot of biodiversity there. And so that was interesting to see too, is that you actually can have working landscapes that have a lot of functional biodiversity below ground.
And I'm just thinking back to your initial kind of intro about, you can imagine walking into a forest, and can you imagine being in the soil and these kind of webs and networks, and, just kind of chuckling about these personalities of these fungi. You might have some that are very giving, and some that are, want everything for themselves, just like us here on the surface. So I appreciate that.
It's a parable for sure. Is like, if you set up an extractive agriculture that's designed to be, very individualistic and selfish, like, why would you expect anything different to be happening in the microbial community underground? But if we learn to collaborate better in our food system, and, make room for more diverse plant communities, like, we'll also see that reflected in the, mutual flourishing underground.
Yeah. Well, since we just had a little discussion about mycorrhizal fungi, I thought I'd talk about complexity and communicating complexity. So these are pretty complex topics as you think about soils and climate, and soils and agriculture are living and dynamic systems. California water and climate change can be really big and hard to grasp. And you've spent so much time listening to growers, observing the landscape, and talking to others. And you've written books and spoken to so many audiences. You're a storyteller. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit with us about how you approach talking about these complex issues, and what's the best way that you've found to bring people along with you.
Yeah, and I should just admit that, like, science was kind of my worst subject in high school. So I didn't come to this early of, feeling like I was going to understand something profound about soil, or even understanding that there was anything deeply relevant to my life there in the earth science class. And I do think that the what and the how can get really complex, but I think the why is actually really taps into some values that, if they're not universal, they're darn near universal. And I think, most folks that I've met in rural communities connected to the food system have some kind of value system around being a good neighbor, and around the profound importance of contributing to something larger than yourself. And to me, that's the why of why, we build soil health, why we care for land together. And so, a lot of times I think conversations start there, and listening to what that value system looks like to the person I'm talking to. What's their community's wisdom about neighborliness and shared land stewardship. And then we can go from there to kind of get into the how and the what of, how we're going to do that. But I think it's really important to remember why. and that it isn't just, this isn't just a technical issue, and it's not outside of us and our human communities. It really is about who we are as people and who we are as a society. And yeah, really, do we want to be a society that takes, or do we want to be a society that gives back? And to me, engaging with a group of people in the place where I am around building up our soil health, that's the profound opportunity, is to like realize our human potential to be a society that gives back and leaves the place where we are maybe a little better for the people that come after us.
Yeah, and I think just building on that, I mean, it's clear through your work that you've gained an enormous appreciation for cultural and agricultural practices of indigenous communities, farmers of color, many different communities. And so I'm wondering if you would share a little bit about your journey. What has it been like to learn from and be inspired by so many BIPOC growers and traditions? And how have you found your place and an appropriate role amongst all of that?
Yeah, I think it's been really humbling for me as a white woman who really came into this world through the organic movement, through a story that started after World War II. At first, the history I knew was really about 75 years deep, about how we started using a lot more chemicals in agriculture after World War II, get bigger, get out, that made things hard for small farmers. And the organic movement is a corrective to that, to try to get us back to the Jeffersonian ideal, of a nation of small farmers and something more ecological. But the deeper I got into this work, the more I realized that that was really just the tip of the iceberg, and I was missing so much. And I think it is really important to come humbly as a white person to this work, recognizing that, everything I might call regenerative agriculture or organic, these are ways of life that have been practiced in indigenous communities and communities of color all over the world for thousands of years, since time immemorial. Regenerative grazing is a reflection of a buffalo prairie ecosystem that indigenous folks in the part of the world where I'm from, have been stewarding literally forever, basically. And also, that extractive agriculture was a tool of colonial economies, and that indigenous communities and communities of color have been honing these regenerative techniques as a protest against extraction from their own communities. And so, these more white-led movements are kind of late to the party. And I think it's just really important to be very humble and to recognize the structural components of these problems, the power imbalances. We need to talk about the fact that I think in Leah Penniman's latest book, she says 94.6% of agricultural land in this country is white owned. We need to talk about that. And we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to create space for this indigenous and BIPOC leadership that has been there, for hundreds and thousands of years, to really be heard and to have agency in shaping what this movement looks like.
And I so appreciated some of the stories in your recent book, and kind of the image of these little tiny pockets of that kind of polyculture popping up amongst the large farms in the Central Valley and the Central Coast and other areas, and what a beautiful kind of tapestry of that kind of that visual is. So I think with that, I do have a question that I want to close with, but before we do that, I wanted to open it up to audience Q&A. So let me pop up here. It looks like we've been getting some questions in the Q&A and in the chat. So let me I'll start here with the Q&A box. And this is a great question from Steve Kafka, where he says, where water for irrigation is limiting, as in large parts of California, especially the San Joaquin Valley, where do cover crops fit in? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you probably know more about it than I do. So I do think that, how we implement soil health practices is really specific, both to place and then also as you're highlighting, Steve, also to, infrastructure and resources that we all have access to. And so I think that would be a really kind of fine-grained question for me to approach with, folks out in the Central Valley working in different farming contexts. I love cover crops, but I'm not going to, sit here and say that they're appropriate for every single farm in every single context. So I think it's really important to think about the overall water budget, what species might be appropriate. So yeah, thanks for that question, because I think it is really nuanced, and we don't want to give the impression that you just take this package of practices and then you just take it anywhere.
Yeah, and I can answer a little bit to that. I think, back to what you said before, Liz, about, appreciating the diversity and not just having a standard practice, and seeing where you are and what the conditions are. This is something that sustainable conservation is actually working on right now, trying to understand the role of cover crops in the drier, more arid regions of the state, especially as that Sustainable Groundwater Management the implementation comes online, and growers are going to be looking at, reduced water allocation and what do they do with their scarce water resources. And so it's a complicated question, and it has some, physical kind of environmental science aspects to it. It definitely has policy aspects to it. So we're looking forward to, we're working with a very large group of kind of multidisciplinary experts on this topic. And Dr. Kafka, I think that's a great question, and not a simple answer yet, but I think there's lots of us working on that. So thank you. So here's a question from Daniel Hoffman, looking at strategies for dealing with legacy pesticides and nitrates in the soil from kind of historic use. And so, thinking about not only, I'm assuming what they're talking about is, using soils and soil practices to clean that up. And then they added on, especially as we're looking more at groundwater recharged or managed flooding of crop to recharge our below ground aquifers. And I think the important point there is to avoid leaching of those pesticides or those nitrates down into the water and further, exacerbating the water quality challenges we have. So I guess you could talk a little bit about strategies for dealing with those legacy pesticides and nitrates.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not really my area of study, but I'm so glad you raised that, because I think so many examples in the history of attempts at sustainable agriculture of being focused on one thing and then forgetting about another issue, that then we pursue a strategy and we realize, we really should have been paying attention to this aspect of the ecology or the hydrology or the legacy of chemicals. So yeah, you're spot on. I'm really interested in the field of bioremediation. I teach in an environmental studies program, and there are other folks around me who work on that. And I totally agree. That's a really, really key thing to think about before we start moving water around at a large scale.
Great. There's another one that's coming in from Oscar Peterson. Looking
Hi,
at
Oscar.
if there's anything that's easily missed when you're trying to diagnose soil health from a plant perspective, rather than a lab or a soil testing perspective, and what are some of the benefits of doing either or both of those methods?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Oscar. And Oscar does all this stuff. He's at UC Santa Barbara. He's the student manager of our Edible Campus Student Farm, and we have this really great organization called the Department of Public Worms, because students at our campus have been really interested in recycling organic waste for a really long time. So yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, I've been excited about some of these newer soil tests that can show you more about what's happening in terms of the living parts of the soil. I think, especially for some of us, maybe where the generational connections around using our senses to see what's going on with our non-human relatives have been broken. I think that this is maybe helping us to kind of rebuild that sense-based awareness. I feel like when I am able to look at a lot of data that comes from soil tests, it actually helps me hone getting that feedback from plants or from, like a physical assessment of soil. I can realize sort of what's correlated to what a little better. Yeah, and I think it's also kind of context dependent too about what is more readily apparent depending on what kind of plant communities you are working with, how much feedback you are getting from plants, or maybe you're at a cycle with a piece of land, maybe you're remediating it, maybe you're actually not growing anything there. That's a time when it's really helpful, I think, to have that soil test feedback. Yeah, and then the other thing, actually, to the last point, is toxins. So, like if you say you're like living in a new place and you're thinking about gardening somewhere, like that's when soil testing to see if there's lead or arsenic can be really helpful. And that's not something you'd want to do by taste,
No, not at all.
We're actually planning to do that at my place because we live right under the flight path. And my partner read something about like, long-term airplanes overhead might lead to some lead buildup. So we're planning to do a soil test for lead before we plant anything this season.
Not by taste. I'm going to ask a few, I think, that pull back from the more technical kind of soil into the bigger kind of systemic, maybe challenges and opportunities. So one is from Seth Cook about the issue of productivity. So, a lot of times, reduced productivity pops up in this debate about, conventional agriculture versus sustainable or regenerative agricultural practices. So just, your thoughts on that, how to deal with that, or any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I think there's two different ways to think about productivity targets. And one is the economic context that we talked about when we were talking about, like, why don't we see more of these soil health practices? Is like, this is real, right? If you're a farmer and this is how you earn your living, your productivity target relates to your economic context. I think if we're thinking more about like global food security, I'm not super concerned about productivity in that conversation. Where I see opportunities to improve food security are in, the massive amount of food waste that we have in our system currently. There's also waste in the way that our animal system is set up. We're using this like massively productive land in the middle part of the country on these like beautiful mollisols to grow animal feed, and in some cases to grow, feedstocks for industrial products and for fuel and stuff like that. So in terms of global food security, if we're thinking about like, how are we going to ensure that everybody has enough to eat and into the future, and with climate change, I'm not super concerned about like an 8% yield gap between organic and conventional, which is what I see in the literature looking at meta-analyses. I'm much more concerned about the 40% of food that's getting wasted. And I'm much more concerned about the like 50% loss of caloric energy through the sort of CAFO animal system that we have. Those are where I see opportunities to improve food security. That all said, I totally understand if you're farming and you're on really thin margins and you're really feeling the squeeze in terms of productivity when it comes to the amount that you need to send off to your markets in order to get the return that you're looking for. And that's where I think we just need to shift the economic incentives for folks who farm. It's not like we're not already using public money to make farming make sense in a vast swath of the Midwest. And so why don't we just align that public money with public benefit? In California, it looks different. We don't do the commodity crops. We do a lot of specialty crops, but we've certainly had a lot of public investment in water and other things like that. So I want it to make sense for farmers economically to utilize the practices that are going to support their bottom line long term. And I think that's absolutely consistent with global food security.
When I think you kind of touched on a little bit on some of the other questions in here around financing. In the time that we have left, I thought since you brought up land tenure, and that's a a big part of your book, and I was wondering, there's a great question, and maybe it's too complicated, but around what needs to actually be done to change those leasing practices or to address land tenure issue that would be more supportive of those longer term benefits through healthy soils practices. What would be the kind of any specific mechanisms or pathways you can think of?
Yeah, it's a big lift, I'm not gonna lie. But this has happened before in our history, right? I mean, we had something called the Homestead Act that was a massive land redistribution. And a lot of, for those of us who have farms in our family background, my grandmother lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl, but I can trace that land back to the Homestead Act in terms of that being allocated for a small farmer to earn a living. And so I think that should be within our ambition. There's a few pieces of legislation out there that are thinking about doing this, of essentially buying land from farmers who are retiring, government buying that land and then reallocating it to new entry farmers, and particularly thinking about those that have been systematically excluded from participation in agriculture. So the Justice for Black Farmers Act was recently reintroduced by Cory Booker and a bunch of other senators. It's a marker bill for the Farm Bill, so a bill that is intended to get included in that larger package. Advocates are pushing for that, and that would do this very thing for Black farmers. Would create an equitable land access service that would purchase land from retiring farmers and would make these grants of land available to those farmers. So I think we should be thinking that big. And then I also think, another area of policy that I think is important is looking at the ways in which farmland is being purchased not by folks who want to grow food or steward land, but by institutional investors who see it as a capital asset. And that's really concerning. That's pushing up the value of farmland. That's keeping land. In some cases, folks aren't even growing anything there. They're just waiting for the value to go up. And then in some cases, they're managing it in ways that aren't really consistent with what's best for the place. But it's really just about patting the Harvard endowment on the other end of the country. So I think that's something we should be regulating. I don't want to see a whole bunch more agricultural. When farmers retire, I don't want to see them forced into selling to institutional investors. So I think there's a place there for policy to think about how we make sure that succession is an opportunity for the next generation of ecological stewards, rather than losing land out of agriculture to these institutional investors.
Great. And I'm looking at time. I know we have more questions left, but Hannah and Kelly have some great questions around supply chains and carbon sequestration financialization. I encourage you to tune in to our third webinar series, where we're going to be talking about grower adoption and supply chains. And then Miguel has a role about farmers and land stewards and the role they have in influencing in communication and influencing policy. So I encourage you to join the next session where we'll be talking a little bit about policy, and then the final webinar where it's all going to be about communication. So apologies we didn't get to your questions, but I did want to say one more question that I have for you, Liz, which is just, I so appreciate you as a storyteller. And so I'm wondering if you could just tell us a story, any story that you'd like to tell to inspire us as we each leave here today and go on with our day.
Yeah, well, I'm super inspired by Ida Guzman's work. You should all follow her. She's a postdoc at UC Irvine currently. And also, another story that I had the privilege to learn more about through this Healing Grounds project, also from California, is the Masumoto family farm story, and specifically speaking with Nikiko Masumoto, who's really leading that farm now as Yonsei, fourth generation Japanese American. And her story is so powerful of how her great-grandparents came to California, farmed, couldn't own land because of the alien land laws, but they continued farming and they dreamed of a better opportunity for their kids. But then their kids, Nikiko's grandparents, they were incarcerated, in this internment period when people were wrongfully taken off to these concentration camps just for being Japanese American. But they fell in love as teenagers. in these camps and decided, that they were going to plant their life in California soil, even though, they had no reason to believe when we talk about, you plant a tree and it's going to take all these years to build up that healthy soil. They, all they could afford was this really hard pan soil in the Central Valley, but they poured everything they had into that land, believing that future generations of their family would have the opportunity to continue to steward, continue to build that healthy soil. And that's what's happened. Nikiko's dad, Moss, worked really hard converting the farm to organic. And she's doing that now as this, fourth generation, growing these beautiful peaches and nectarines and apricots. And so just that sense of claiming a place of belonging, and really understanding that deep relationship between soil and community, and then extending that sense of belonging to everybody else in the Central Valley and California. And she's such a powerful advocate for inclusiveness in agriculture. So that's a story that continues to inspire me.
I agree. And I think just even, her story of where she was planning on going in her life and then ending up how she came back to the farm and the journey that she went through was so inspiring. Well, with that, we're almost out of time. So thank you so much, Liz, for being with us today and sharing your wisdom. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you are interested in learning more about Liz's work, visit her website at www.lizcarlisle.com. And I hope someone can pop that in the chat. And I thank you. And I encourage you to read her most recent book, Healing Grounds. It is a beautiful and compelling blend of sociology and anthropology and history and environmental science. And it's all using farmer stories as kind of a basis for a discussion about how we as humans produce and interact with food. So highly recommend it. You can find that on her website. The next webinar in this series will be on May 3rd, and we'll do a deeper dive into that soil and water connection in conversation with representatives from research, environmental justice and agroecology and policy. The registration page for that will be up soon, so stay tuned via email or on our social media. After that, in our third webinar, we're going to talk to growers and food companies about barriers and solutions to increasing grower adoption of these practices. And then in our final webinar, we're going to wrap up talking to science communicators about the successes and challenges of communicating complex issues like soils, water, and climate. So if you would like to follow Sustainable Conservation's work, there's some information on the screen here. You can find us on social media, subscribe to our email list, or even consider a donation. These webinars and our work are fueled by the generous contributions of organizations and individuals like you. And right now, all new and increased donations are being matched dollar for dollar. So please consider donating by visiting suscon.org/give or scanning the QR code on your screen. And with that, thank you again, Liz, for joining us. Thank you, everyone else, for joining. And we hope to see you again on May 3rd. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody. I know you're all doing really important work out there, so thank you so much for that too.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.